DC1 Enterprise is a veteran-owned and operated home service contractor servicing the greater Philadelphia area. Whether you need those gutters cleaned out, your water heater replaced, or a kitchen upgrade, contact DC1 Enterprise. www.dc1enterprise.com. DC1 gets it done.
There are moments in history when the world shifts so quietly that no one realizes it's happening. No trumpet sounds. No official announcement is made. No line is crossed that anyone can point to and say, "That's when it began." The American Revolution was one of those moments. It didn't start with gunfire. It didn't start with a declaration. It started with frustration, with farmers who felt ignored, merchants who felt cheated, families who felt like they were living under rules written by people who had never walked their streets, tilled their soil, or risked their lives in this wilderness. This is the story of how that frustration turned into rebellion, how rebellion turned into war, and how a collection of colonies became a nation. This is the story of the American Revolution. A world that felt stable until it didn't. In the early 1700s, life in the American colonies was, by most measures, good. The land was fertile. Work was plentiful. Trade flowed through busy ports like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Most colonists thought of themselves as British subjects, loyal to the crown, proud of their connection to the most powerful empire on earth. They governed themselves in local assemblies. They ran their own businesses. They lived with relative freedom. And for decades, Britain largely left them alone. But empires, like people, change when they're afraid. And in the mid-17th century, Britain was afraid. The debt that lit the fuse. From 1754 to 1763, Britain fought a brutal conflict known in America as the French and Indian War. It was a global war, fought across continents, and it cost a fortune. Britain won, but victory came with crushing debt. So Parliament looked across the Atlantic and saw 13 prosperous colonies, and they thought, they should help pay for this. From London's perspective, it made sense. British soldiers had protected colonial land. British money had funded the war. But to the colonists, it felt different, because they had no say in the decision, no seats in Parliament, no voice in the laws, no representation. Still, the taxes came. First, the Stamp Act, taxing newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and even playing cards. It wasn't just the money, it was the message that Parliament could reach into colonial life whenever it pleased. The reaction was immediate. Protests erupted. Merchants boycotted British goods. Tax collectors were harassed, threatened, even forced to resign. And for the first time, a phrase began spreading from colony to colony. No taxation without representation. Britain backed down, but the damage was done. The colonists had discovered something powerful: unity. When tension turned deadly, Britain didn't like backing down, so they tried again. This time with the Townshend Acts, taxing glass, paint, lead, paper, and tea. To enforce the laws, British soldiers were sent to Boston. Redcoats patrolled the streets. They stood outside shops. They occupied public spaces. To the colonists, it felt like an occupation. Tension grew. Insults were exchanged. Fights broke out. Resentment simmered. Then, on the night of March 5th, 1770, everything snapped. A crowd gathered around a group of British soldiers. Words turned into shouts. Shouts turned into thrown objects. Someone rang a bell. Someone yelled, "Fire!" A musket went off, then another, then several more. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. One of them was Crispus Attucks, a dock worker, a man of mixed African and Native American descent. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's engraving spread across the colonies, showing red-coated soldiers firing mercilessly into an unarmed crowd. The image wasn't entirely accurate, but it didn't need to be. It told a story people were ready to believe, that Britain would kill to maintain control. The tea that poured out an empire. For a few years things calmed down, but beneath the surface resentment was growing. Then came the Tea Act. Parliament gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. The tea was cheaper, but it came with a catch. Buying it meant accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies, and to many Americans that was unacceptable. So on a cold December night in 1773, a group of men boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They wore disguises, they said little, and one by one they smashed open 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the water. Tons of tea gone. Not stolen, not sold, destroyed. The message was unmistakable, and Britain was furious. The point of no return. Parliament responded with force. They closed Boston Harbor. They stripped Massachusetts of its self-government. They allowed British troops to be housed in private homes. These laws became known in America as the Intolerable Acts. And this time, the colonies didn't respond individually, they came together. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress. They didn't declare independence, they didn't call for war. But they did something just as important. They stood together, and they began preparing for what might come next, because everyone felt it. Something was coming. The shots that changed the world. In April of 1775, British troops were sent to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonial weapons. But the colonists were ready. Riders spread the alarm through the countryside. Among them was Paul Revere. When British troops reached Lexington Green, they found a small group of colonial militiamen waiting. No one knows who fired first. But once the shooting started, history changed. The British marched on to Concord and were met with resistance. Militia fired from behind trees, fences, and stone walls. The British retreat became a running battle. By the time they reached Boston, nearly 300 redcoats were dead or wounded. The war had begun. From protest to independence. At first, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They weren't fighting for independence. They were fighting for rights. But that changed in 1776. A pamphlet appeared across the colonies. It was called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. In plain language, Paine argued something radical, that kings were unnecessary, that monarchy was tyranny, that a continent should not be ruled by an island. The pamphlet sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It changed minds. It hardened resolve. And on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Not a request, not a negotiation, a declaration. It accused King George III of tyranny. It proclaimed that all men are created equal, and it ended with a pledge: our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They knew what they were risking. They signed anyway. War against impossible odds. The war that followed was brutal. The British had the world's strongest navy. professional soldiers, money, experience. The Americans had farmers, merchants, and volunteers. They lacked supplies, they lacked training, they lacked shoes. George Washington held the army together through sheer will. Winters were harsh. Valley Forge nearly broke them. Men froze, starved, deserted. But they didn't quit. Slowly the tide turned. France joined the war, seeing a chance to weaken Britain. Supplies arrived, morale improved, and in 1781, British General Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown, surrounded, outgunned, outnumbered. When he surrendered, the war was effectively over. 2 years later, Britain formally recognized the United States of America. What the Revolution really meant. The American Revolution didn't create a perfect nation. Slavery still existed. Women couldn't vote. Native Americans were pushed aside. The promise of equality was incomplete. But the idea behind it was revolutionary. That power comes from the people. That government exists to serve it, not rule. That freedom is worth fighting for. It was an experiment, one the world had never seen before, and one that continues imperfect and unfinished to this day. Closing. The men and women of the American Revolution weren't heroes because they were flawless. They were heroes because they were willing to risk everything for an idea that said people could govern themselves, that freedom mattered, that liberty was worth the cost. And every generation since has been left with the same responsibility to protect it, to question it, to live up to it. Because the revolution didn't end in 1783. It simply passed to us. This has been the Daily American Podcast, and this is our story.